Today I thought that I would simply tell you a little bit about who I say that Jesus is. To begin with, Jesus is a historical construct. That means throughout history we've constructed a story about Jesus. We've used a little bit of historical context, a lot of hyperbole or exaggeration, some myth, some legend, some traditions borrowed from other traditions, and we've mixed them all together in the scriptures and in the traditions of the church, in our hymnody, and we have constructed a story about Jesus. The story of Jesus is about God with creation. The story of Jesus is about the kingdom of God working its way out through us. I'll give you a couple of stories to illustrate who Jesus is for me. Several years ago, I was doing chaplaincy work at a hospital. I was working the emergency ward. I got a phone call. A little boy had drowned. And so they were still working on him in the recovery room, so they called me in. I got there, and as you can imagine, there was chaos. The father had arrived, but they hadn't been able to contact the mother yet. She was out running errands with the younger two children because they were going to go camping that weekend. It was a long weekend. And so she wasn't reachable. The father was beside himself. He was inside and outside looking for the mom and knowing that he needed to be with his son. So finally he just sort of set up camp in the recovery room with his son. And I was there with him for about 15 minutes before the doctor finally came to him and said, "We have to stop treatment now. We've been working on him for an hour and there hasn't been any response." The father took in that information and finally said, "Yes, okay." And they stopped treatment and the boy was pronounced dead. The chief nurse of the emergency ward, with whom I had been in constant conflict for weeks, cleared the room. She got all the doctors out of there. She had one nurse stay with her, and they disconnected all the tubes and all of the machinery that the boy was hooked up to. And she told the father to sit down, and he sat down. And she wrapped the boy up in a blanket, picked him up, and put him in his father's arms. And then she looked at me as if to say, "It's your job now," and she left. And I sat with that father and his son for a long, long time. At one point, he placed his son back up on the recovery table and he curled up beside him. Finally, the mother showed up. Now, the mother had been given the information from her friends and neighbors that her husband was at the hospital. She had to get there right away. So she showed up thinking that something was wrong with her husband. And when we tried to tell her that no, it was her son and her son was dead, she couldn't take the information in. She couldn't hear us. And so the first information that she got that her son was dead was when she went into the recovery room, and there he was on the recovery table. As you can imagine, she became hysterical. She started screaming and yelling. She tried to throw things. She was hitting her husband. The doctor suggested that we needed to call security, and I said, "No, give her husband a few more minutes to calm her down." Eventually, he finally calmed her down by grabbing her by the shoulders and saying, "We have 2 other sons. We need to care for them." For the next 2 weeks, my supervisor and I met with many other staff in the hospital, counseling them as they were grieving. An occupational therapist from the mental health unit, a young father who was a custodian in the cancer unit, say Jesus is. Jesus was that little boy who died a senseless, meaningless death. A meaningful life, but a meaningless death.
What's that?
Jesus was that emergency ward nurse who has a profound wisdom to disregard hospital policy and let that father hold his son one last time before the autopsy.
What?
Jesus was that father, holding the broken body of his son. Broken hopes, broken dreams, broken promises in his arms. Jesus was a mother, screaming in agony, crying out for justice and fairness that didn't exist. Jesus was that whole community of the hospital as it grieved, as it prayed for that boy and his family. The story of Jesus is about God with us. The story of Jesus is about the kingdom of God working its way out through us. Another story. Several years ago, I bought myself a great big telescope. Some of you have seen it. It's huge. And we did a vacation Bible school where we focused on the Christmas story. And it was an evening Bible school so that parents and grandparents could stick around and share the fun with the kids. One evening we went out to make like the Magi and look at the stars. So we took the kids out with my telescope to the golf course. And we started looking at the stars. It was beautiful. Just a perfect night for stargazing. And Saturn was always the first thing that I try to show people. If Saturn's up, I try to show Saturn first because it's a neat experience. Saturn was, its axis were tipped towards the Earth so that you can see the planet, you can see the rings really clearly. In fact, you can see through the rings and see the space beyond them. You can see the shadow of the rings on the surface of the planet itself. It was so incredibly clear that night. And one fellow who came out with us, he was in his mid to late 70s. He was out there with his great-grandson. And he leaned down, he looked through the telescope, and he looked through the telescope for a long, long time. And when he stood up, he had tears in his eyes, and he said, "Wow." And then he showed his great-grandson what he had seen. When we are overwhelmed with wonder and awe, when we're overwhelmed with joy and a sense of connectedness to something that is incredibly mysterious to us, when we're overwhelmed with gratitude, that's Jesus. The story of Jesus is about God with us. The story of Jesus is about the kingdom of God working itself out through us. May we be knowing and willing participants in the fullness of that story.